The polished marble floor of the foyer was exactly as Julian Blackwood remembered it. A cold, unblinking mirror reflecting a man he no longer recognized. 7 years had passed since he'd last stood here, 7 years of building an empire on the ashes of his personal life, but the cavernous silence of the house was unchanged. He saw her then, standing at the top of the sweeping staircase, a small figure in a pristine white dress, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought his grief had finally fractured his mind. But it was the faint, almost imperceptible scent of antiseptic that clung to the air which told him this was no ghost. It was a carefully curated exhibit, and the child who was supposed to be dead was its centerpiece. Julian's gaze swept over the entrance hall, a space designed to impress, to intimidate. It was a mausoleum of wealth, filled with abstract sculptures and paintings that were worth more than most people's homes. Yet it held all the warmth of a surgical theater. He remembered a time when this hall echoed with the clumsy, joyful sounds of a toddler learning to walk, when a bright pink tricycle had been perpetually parked by the grand piano, a vibrant scar on the otherwise perfect decor. Now, there were no such imperfections. Every surface gleamed under the recessed lighting. Every shadow was intentional. The air was still and sterile, scrubbed clean of any lingering scent of life. No flowers, no food, no perfume. It was the scent of absence, a meticulously maintained void. He ran a hand over a mahogany console table, the wood cool and lifeless beneath his touch. He had bought this piece with his late wife in a different life, a different home. Here, placed by Catherine, it was just another object, stripped of memory and meaning. This house wasn't a home. It was a statement of control, and every sterile detail felt like a deliberate erasure of the past he had shared within these walls, an erasure of him. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were trespassing in a life that should have been his, a life from which he had been surgically excised. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute, a testament to how thoroughly Catherine had scrubbed his presence from this place, leaving behind only the cold, hard shell of their shared history. Catherine descended the stairs first, her movements fluid, practiced. She was a vision of bereaved grace, the same one she'd projected to the world for years. "Julian," she said, her voice a finely tuned instrument of surprise and faint disapproval. "This is unexpected." He ignored her, his eyes locked on the girl who followed a few steps behind. Lily. She was 11 now, not the 4-year-old he held in his memory, a ghost with bright pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. This child was pale and unnervingly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. As she reached the bottom step, the light from the chandelier caught the inside of her left wrist, revealing a raw, red patch of skin, like a burn that had been scrubbed raw. "She had a fall," Catherine said smoothly, her eyes following his. The lie was instant, effortless. She scraped her wrist on the flagstones by the pool. "You know how clumsy children can be." Julian's mind reeled. The tip from the fired nanny had been insane. A desperate, rambling message about a girl kept like a doll in a glass box. He'd come here expecting to expose a cruel hoax, to confront Catherine's madness. But the child was real, his child. And Catherine's lie, so quick and plausible, was the first brick in a wall he knew, with chilling certainty, he would have to tear down piece by piece. He looked from the sterile perfection of the house to the raw mark on his daughter's skin, and he understood. He hadn't returned to a home. He had breached a fortress. A quiet, terrible wrongness settled in his gut, cold and heavy as a stone. For 7 years he had mourned a death. Now he suspected he had to investigate a life. That evening, dinner was an exercise in theatrical normalcy. The long, formal dining table was set for 3, a gleaming expanse of polished mahogany that felt more like a negotiating table than a place for family. Catherine sat at its head, a queen presiding over her silent, sterile kingdom. She orchestrated the meal with a serene smile that never quite reached her eyes, talking about Lily's tutors, her pony, her carefully managed world. It was a monologue of perfection, a performance for an audience of one. Julian played his part, asking the expected questions, keeping his voice even, but his attention was a laser focused on his daughter. Lily sat between them, a ghost at the feast. She ate with a precision that was unnatural for a child, her small hands holding the heavy silver cutlery with an adult's rigid grip. She cut her food into tiny, identical squares. She never spilled a drop. She never made a sound. Each movement was deliberate, cautious, as if she were navigating a minefield. Julian watched her, his heart a cold knot in his chest. He saw the way her eyes would flicker toward her mother before she picked up her glass, a silent request for permission. He saw the tension in her small shoulders, the constant low-level fear of making a mistake. The child was a porcelain doll, and Catherine was the collector who would not tolerate a single crack. "Lily, tell your father about the recital," Catherine prompted, her voice like honey laced with steel. Lily flinched, a barely perceptible motion. She placed her fork down, perfectly aligned with her knife. "I played Chopin," she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy thing. She didn't look at Julian. She looked at her plate. "She was magnificent," Catherine said, answering for her. "The instructor said she has a prodigious talent. A true gift." Julian tried to catch his daughter's eye. "I'd love to hear you play sometime, Lily." A flicker of something, panic, maybe, crossed the girl's face. She looked at her mother again, a prisoner checking with her guard. Catherine gave a slight, almost invisible shake of her head. Lily's gaze dropped back to her plate. I don't practice much anymore." The lie was so blatant, so clearly coerced, it was like a physical blow. The air crackled with the unspoken. Julian wanted to scream, to sweep the perfectly arranged plates from the table, to grab Lily and run. But he knew that would be a catastrophic mistake. He was on enemy territory, and the enemy held all the power. He had to be patient. He had to be the soldier he once was, observing, gathering intelligence, waiting for the precise moment to strike. As the meal concluded, a memory surfaced, sharp and painful in its contrast. He remembered Lily at 3, sitting in a high chair in their old, much smaller kitchen. He'd been making pancakes, his one culinary skill, and she'd had batter smeared all over her face, in her hair, a joyous, sticky mess. He'd flipped a pancake too high, and it had landed on his head. Lily had erupted in a fit of giggles, a pure, uninhibited sound that had filled the whole house. She had pointed at him, her little face alight with glee, shouting, "Silly daddy! Hat pancake!" He could still feel the warmth of that kitchen, smell the sweetness of the batter, hear the sound of that innocent, beautiful laughter. He looked at the silent, pale girl sitting across from him, a girl who was afraid to meet his eyes, and the chasm between then and now was an uncrossable, heartbreaking void. The pancake hat was a memory from a world that Catherine had not just left behind, but had systematically burned to the ground. Later, as a maid cleared the table, Julian asked if he could see Lily's room. Catherine's smile tightened, but she couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. She led him upstairs, her hand resting possessively on Lily's shoulder. The room was as immaculate as the rest of the house. A large dollhouse sat in one corner, its inhabitants arranged in a perfect, static tableau. The bed was made with military precision, not a wrinkle in the pale pink duvet. There were no posters on the walls, no scattered toys, no signs of the chaotic, creative life of a child. It was a showroom. "It's late," Catherine said, her voice a soft command. "Lily needs her rest." He knelt down in front of his daughter, trying to find a flicker of the girl he remembered in her vacant eyes. "It's good to see you, Lilybug," he said, using the old nickname. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. A shadow of confusion, a ghost of a memory. But then she looked past him, at her mother standing in the doorway like a sentinel, and the mask of perfect compliance snapped back into place. Catherine stepped forward, smoothly interrupting the moment. "We'll see you in the morning, Julian. I've had the guest wing prepared." She guided Lily to the bed, turned down the covers, and tucked her in with a series of precise, emotionless movements. It wasn't a mother tucking in her child. It was an archivist storing a priceless, fragile artifact for the night. As Julian turned to leave, he saw it on the nightstand. A worn, one-eyed teddy bear. It was Barnaby, the bear he'd given Lily on the day she was born. It was the only object in the entire room that looked loved, the only thing out of place in the sterile perfection. It was a relic of a buried past, a silent testament to a life Catherine had tried, and failed, to completely erase. The next day, Julian made an excuse to leave the house, a fabricated meeting with his financial advisors. The real meeting was in a quiet, anonymous coffee shop with a woman named Maria, Lily's nanny for the first year after the so-called recovery. She had been the one to send the desperate, anonymous email. Maria was a small, nervous woman in her late 50s, her hands trembling as she clutched her cup. It took him 20 minutes of calm, steady reassurance before she would even meet his eyes. "She fired me because I bought the girl a coloring book," Maria began, her voice barely a whisper. "Said it was unseemly, messy. She threw it in the incinerator. The crayons, too." Julian leaned forward, keeping his own rage tightly coiled. "Tell me everything, Maria. Don't leave anything out." Maria's story tumbled out, a fragmented portrait of quiet horror. She spoke of the rigid, unyielding schedule, the lack of play, the way Lily was never allowed to get her clothes dirty. Any small infraction, a smudge of dirt on her dress or a scuff on her shoe, was met with a chillingly calm but terrifying response from Catherine. "She would take her to the bathroom," Maria said, her gaze distant, haunted. "She would lock the door. You could hear the water running for a long, long time. And the scrubbing. Lily would come out, pale, shaking, and so clean, too clean. Her skin would be red and raw." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "Catherine called them cleansing baths," she said. "She was washing away the impurities, the ugliness." Julian felt a cold dread seep into his bones. The mark on Lily's wrist. It wasn't from a fall. It was from being scrubbed raw. "What else?" he pressed, his voice low and hard. "The silence," Maria said, shaking her head. "That house. It's not a quiet house, Mr. Blackwood. It's a silent one. Lily was not allowed to shout, or sing loudly, or laugh too much. Catherine said ladies were serene, composed. She was erasing the child in her, turning her into one of those dolls in her room." Maria reached into her worn handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She slid it across the table. "I found this in the trash before she fired me. Kept it. I don't know why. It just felt important." Julian unfolded the paper. It was a child's drawing, done in shaky crayon. On one side of the page was a big, smiling stick figure with yellow hair, labeled Daddy. On the other side was a small, crying stick figure in a black box, with angry red scribbles all over it. In the middle, a tall, severe figure with no mouth stood between them, holding a big black key. He stared at the drawing, the crude, simple lines conveying a truth more profound than any witness testimony. The black box, the red scribbles, the key. This wasn't just a drawing. It was a map of his daughter's prison. It was a cry for help from a girl who had forgotten his face but not his existence. He carefully folded the paper and put it in his pocket. Felt heavier than a block of lead. It was evidence. It was a promise. He returned to the house late that afternoon, his mind a cold engine of calculation. Catherine was in the garden, directing a landscaper with imperious gestures. It gave him the opening he needed. He found Lily in the library, sitting in a large armchair with a book in her lap. She wasn't reading it. She was just staring at the page, her expression blank. He sat on the ottoman in front of her. "That's a good story," he said quietly, nodding at the book. She didn't respond, her eyes remaining fixed on the illustrations. He decided to test Catherine's story. "Your mother told me you fell by the pool," he said, his voice gentle. "Did it hurt much?" Lily's hands tightened on the book. She gave a small, jerky shake of her head. "No." "What happened then?" he asked softly. She flinched, her gaze darting towards the doorway as if expecting her mother to appear at any moment. She wouldn't speak. She couldn't. He had the drawing in his pocket, a silent scream. He had Maria's testimony. But he needed something from Lily herself, a crack in the wall of silence. He looked at the bookshelf behind her, filled with pristine, unread classics. No dog-eared paperbacks, no well-loved fairy tales. Just more props for the perfect stage. He saw a key, a large, ornate skeleton key, sitting on the mantelpiece as a decorative object. It looked just like the one in the drawing. On a pure, desperate impulse, he stood up, took the key from the mantel, and knelt back down in front of Lily. He held it out on the palm of his hand, saying nothing. Her eyes widened. She stared at the key, her breath hitching. A single tear tracked its way down her pale cheek, and then another. The silent, composed doll was cracking. The prisoner was recognizing the tool of her own confinement. That night, Julian lay awake in the sterile guest suite, the child's drawing spread out on the bed beside him. The smiling stick-figure father, the crying girl in the box, the silent jailer with the key. It was all there. He finally allowed the rage he had been suppressing to surface. It was a cold, quiet fury, not the hot, explosive anger of his youth, but something far more dangerous. It was the calculated rage of a man who had lost everything once and would burn the world to the ground before he allowed it to happen again. He knew he couldn't simply snatch Lily and run. Catherine was a master manipulator, a pillar of her community. She had woven a web of sympathy and lies around herself for 7 years. He was the absentee father, the billionaire shark who had abandoned his family. No one would believe him without undeniable proof. He needed to find the source of the rot. He needed to find the lock that the key in the drawing belonged to. He waited until well after 2 a.m., when the house was sunk in its profound silence. He moved through the darkened corridors like a wraith, his bare feet making no sound on the polished floors. He avoided the main security sensors, his mind mapping the layout from memory, a skill honed in a past life he rarely spoke of. His objective was Catherine's private space, her bedroom, her dressing room, her ensuite bathroom. He started with her office, a sterile space of glass and steel. He searched her desk, her files. Nothing. It was all finances, charity galas, social engagements. The public face. He moved to the bedroom. It was as cold and impersonal as a hotel suite. He checked the closets, the drawers. Nothing but designer clothes and expensive jewelry. Then he entered the master bathroom. It was a temple of marble and chrome, vast and echoing, and it smelled faintly of the same antiseptic he'd noticed on his first day. His eyes scanned the pristine surfaces, the neatly arranged, high-end cosmetics. It was too perfect. His gaze fell upon a locked cabinet beneath one of the twin vanities, a small, unassuming thing made of dark wood. It was the only piece of furniture in the room that didn't match the modern, minimalist aesthetic. It was old, a relic. He retrieved a small toolkit he had brought with him, his hand steady as he worked on the simple lock, clicked open with a soft snick. The rage he'd been holding in check threatened to boil over as he saw the contents. Inside, neatly arranged on a velvet cloth, were not medicines or toiletries. There were several coarse, stiff-bristled brushes, the kind used for scrubbing floors. There was a bar of harsh, lye-based soap, the type that would strip skin raw. And there was a small, leather-bound book. A journal. He opened it, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. Catherine's elegant, looping script filled the pages. It wasn't a diary of events, but a ledger of sins. Lily spoke of her father today, an impurity, a stain from the past. Cleansed it for 20 minutes, another entry. A smudge of mud on her dress. Carelessness is a form of corruption. The brush was required to purify her. And another, more chilling. She drew a picture of him, burned it, washed her hands until they were clean of his memory. It was a manual of systematic psychological torture, a manifesto of erasure. This was the instrument of cruelty, not a whip or a rod, but a brush and a bar of soap, wielded to scrub his memory, his very existence, from his own daughter's mind and body. He closed the journal, his knuckles white. The antiseptic smell, the raw skin, the silence. It all snapped into a horrifying, cohesive picture. He placed everything back exactly as he had found it, locked the cabinet, and retreated as silently as he had come. He now understood the twisted logic. Catherine wasn't just abusing their daughter. She was trying to cleanse her of him. And as he stood in the dark hallway, a new, ice-cold resolve settled over him. He was done observing. The soldier's patience had reached its limit. It was time to plan the assault. The next morning, Julian put the first phase of his plan into motion. He made a call from the gardens, his back to the house, his voice a low murmur that wouldn't carry. The man on the other end was Michael Vance, the head of his personal security and a former intelligence analyst. "Vance," Julian said, "I want everything you can find on Catherine Blackwood, née Sterling. Sealed records, juvenile history, family background. I want to know where she learned this. I want to know what broke her." He knew there had to be a source, a trauma in her own past that had curdled into this monstrous need for control and purification. He was no longer just fighting his ex-wife, he was fighting her ghosts. Later that day, Catherine announced they were all going to a small, private garden party at a neighbor's estate. It was a command performance. Julian knew he had to go, to maintain the facade of the returning father, tentatively rebuilding bridges. The entire event was an agonizing exercise in restraint. He stood on a perfectly manicured lawn, a glass of champagne in his hand, surrounded by people who saw Catherine as a tragic, sainted figure. They offered him condolences for his loss, their faces etched with sympathy for a grief he now knew was a lie. He nodded, murmured his thanks, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He watched Catherine move through the crowd, radiating a serene, brittle elegance. And he watched Lily, who stood beside her mother, a silent, beautiful accessory. A woman approached them, gushing about how well-behaved Lily was. "She's an angel," the woman cooed. Never a peep out of her. Catherine smiled, a proud, proprietary look on her face. Julian wanted to grab the woman by the shoulders and scream, "She's not an angel. She's a hostage." His knuckles were white around the stem of his glass. He felt like a bomb, ticking down to detonation, forced to smile and nod while the fuse burned shorter and shorter. He managed to find a moment alone with Lily by a stone fish pond. The other children were running and shouting on the far side of the lawn, a chaotic, joyful pack. Lily watched them with a look of profound, uncomprehending longing. She was an exile watching a tribe she would never be allowed to join. "They look like they're having fun," Julian said softly. Lily nodded, her eyes fixed on a little girl with grass stains on her knees. She didn't seem to notice that she was twisting a fold of her pristine white dress in her hands, a small, anxious gesture. Julian knelt beside her, his voice a whisper. "Lily, the baths, the scrubbing. Does it hurt?" Her breath caught. She pulled her hand away from her dress as if she'd been burned, snapping back into her conditioned stillness. She shook her head, a frantic, unconvincing denial. Her eyes were wide with terror, not at the memory of the pain, but at the fact that he knew. He had broken the first rule of her prison. You do not speak of the prison. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder, wanting to comfort her but knowing that any physical contact might terrify her more. He saw the sheer, soul-deep exhaustion in her eyes. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'm here now." She looked at him, then truly looked at him for the first time. Her lower lip trembled. She leaned in, so close he could feel her small, shaky breath against his ear, and whispered a single, devastating sentence. "She says you're the dirt." Then she pulled back, her face a mask of terror at her own transgression, and fled back to her mother's side. The words hung in the air, a final, damning piece of the puzzle. "You're the dirt." He wasn't just a forgotten memory. He was the impurity. He was the stain Catherine was trying to scrub from their daughter's soul. He stood by the pond, the sounds of the party fading into a dull roar, his mission now crystalline in its clarity. He wasn't just saving his daughter. He was fighting for his very existence in her heart. 2 days later, Vance delivered. A sleek, encrypted file arrived on Julian's tablet. He locked himself in his guest suite and opened it. What he found was not just a background check. It was a tragedy. Catherine Sterling had been the only child of a wealthy, fanatically religious family. Her mother had been obsessed with purity, both spiritual and physical. Her father had been a distant, cold disciplinarian. The file contained sealed court documents from a custody hearing when Catherine was 12, initiated by a concerned teacher. There were testimonies describing a childhood of obsessive-compulsive cleaning rituals, of punishments for any sign of worldly contamination. There was a psychologist's report that described Catherine as a child with a profound fear of moral and physical impurity. Likely instilled by her primary caregivers, the case had been dismissed. The family's wealth and influence had seen to that. But the damage was done. She had escaped her parents' prison only to meticulously rebuild it for her own daughter. Casting Julian in the role of the dirt she had been taught to fear and despise her entire life. Julian closed the tablet, a feeling of grim understanding settling over him. This wasn't about him, not really. It wasn't about his failures as a husband or the bitter divorce. He had just been the catalyst, the impurity, that activated the deeply programmed pathology inside Catherine. He was the ultimate stain she could never scrub clean. As he processed this, a memory of his own failure surfaced with brutal clarity. He remembered the last fight he'd had with Catherine before he left. She had been begging him not to go, not to choose the international merger over them. Lily, just 4, had walked in, holding Barnaby the bear, her face crumpled with fear at their raised voices. Julian, consumed by ambition and anger, had brushed past them both. "I have to do this," he'd said, not to them but to himself. It's important. He had walked out that door choosing his empire over his family. He had left his daughter in the care of a woman he knew was brittle and controlling, but he had never suspected she was broken in this monstrous way. His ambition hadn't just cost him his marriage. It had left his daughter undefended, delivered into the hands of a monster he had helped create through his own neglect. The guilt was a physical weight, but it didn't paralyze him. It forged his resolve into something unbreakable. He now had the motive. He had the weapon. He had the witness. He had the will. That afternoon, the pressure finally made Catherine crack. Julian was in the library with Lily, reading to her in a low, calm voice. For the first time, she seemed to be relaxing, her rigid posture softening as she listened to the story. Catherine walked in, her face a thundercloud. She was holding a small, muddy leaf. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a barely suppressed hysteria. She held it up for Julian to see. "I found it on the rug in the hall. You brought it in. You brought your filth into my clean house." It was so absurd, so disproportionate, that for a moment Julian was speechless. Before he could respond, Lily, caught in the crossfire, flinched and let out a tiny gasp. That was all it took. Catherine's fury swiveled, redirecting to the easier target. "You see?" she hissed, her eyes wild. "You see the chaos you bring? You are upsetting her. You are contaminating everything." She grabbed Lily's arm, her fingers digging in. "We need to go. We need to get clean." It was the mistake he had been waiting for. The loss of control. The public act. He stood up slowly, placing himself between Catherine and their daughter. "Let her go, Catherine," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The quiet was worse than shouting. It was the eerie calm at the center of a hurricane. "You have no right," she spat. "You abandoned us. You are the dirt, the stain I have spent 7 years scrubbing away." It was a full confession, screamed in the quiet of the library, and it was all he needed. He already knew the date of the annual Children's Hospital charity luncheon she was hosting at the house in 3 days. It was her signature event, the crown jewel of her philanthropic facade. He had his stage. He had his script. The final act was about to begin. The day of the luncheon arrived, a perfect, sun-drenched afternoon. The grounds of the estate were filled with the city's elite, women in designer dresses and men in expensive suits, all there to celebrate the generosity of the sainted Catherine Blackwood. She was in her element, gliding through the crowd, a gracious hostess accepting praise for her tireless work. Julian watched from the edge of the terrace, a silent, ominous presence. He had Lily by his side. He had instructed her to keep a specific drawing in the pocket of her dress, the one she had made of the stick figures and the key. Vance and a two-person team from the local Child Protective Services were parked in a discreet vehicle a quarter-mile down the road, waiting for his signal. A prominent family court judge, an old friend Julian had called in a favor from, was among the guests, positioned to be a key witness. Everything was in place. Julian waited until Catherine was at the podium, beginning her welcoming speech. Then, holding Lily's hand, he walked to the front of the crowd and stood directly in her line of sight. She faltered, her practiced smile flickering. "Catherine," Julian said, his voice calm but carrying across the hushed lawn. "Before you continue, there's something Lily would like to show everyone." A murmur went through the crowd. Catherine's face went rigid. "Julian, this is neither the time nor the place." "I think it's the perfect time," he said, his eyes locking with hers. He knelt beside Lily. "It's okay, sweetheart. You can show them." With a trembling hand, Lily pulled the folded drawing from her pocket. Julian took it from her, unfolded it, and held it up for the guests to see. "Lily drew this. This is her family." "That's me," he said, pointing to the smiling stick figure. "And this is Lily, in a box." His voice was cold and clear. "And that's you, Catherine, the one with the key." The gasp from the crowd was audible. Catherine's face had drained of all color. "This is ridiculous," she stammered. "He's put her up to this. He's trying to poison you against me after all these years of absence." "Is it ridiculous, Catherine?" Julian pressed on, his voice like ice. "Or is it about the cleansing baths? Is it about the brushes you use to scrub her raw when she mentions my name? Is it about scrubbing away the impurities? The stains?" He was using her own words, the words from her journal. Catherine's composure shattered. Her carefully constructed mask crumbled into 1,000 pieces. "He is the stain!" she shrieked, her voice high and ragged, pointing a trembling finger at Julian. "He is the filth. I have kept her clean. I have kept her pure. I had to. You don't understand. The dirt gets everywhere." It was a full public implosion. A confession screamed for all her admirers to hear. The guests stared, horrified, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. And then, the pivotal moment. Lily, who had been hiding behind Julian's legs, took a small, hesitant step forward. She looked at her mother, at the raving, hysterical woman who had replaced the cold, controlled automaton she had always known. And for the first time, she did not look afraid. She looked at her with something like pity. She reached out and took her father's hand. A small, simple act of choosing. It was an act of defiance, an act of alignment, an act of liberation. Julian squeezed her hand gently and pulled out his phone. He pressed a single button. "It's done," he said into the phone. Then he looked at the judge, who was already discreetly making his own call. The facade was not just shattered. It was obliterated. Within 15 minutes, the quiet hum of the garden party was broken by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A police car and an unmarked sedan pulled up to the front of the house. The guests parted like the Red Sea as two uniformed officers and a man and a woman in plain clothes from Child Protective Services approached the terrace. Catherine stared at them, her face a mask of disbelief, her tirade having collapsed into ragged, choking sobs. The party was over. The woman from CPS, her face calm and professional, knelt to speak with Lily, who was still clinging to Julian's hand. The male officer began quietly taking statements from the stunned guests, starting with the judge, whose testimony would be unshakable. As this was happening, Julian saw a familiar, nervous figure hovering near the edge of the service entrance. It was Maria, the former nanny. Vance had contacted her, assuring her she would be protected. Seeing the authorities, seeing Catherine's complete and public downfall, she finally found her courage. She walked over to the second police officer, her back straight, and began to speak, her voice gaining strength with every word. She told them about the locked bathroom, the scrubbing sounds, the coloring book thrown in the incinerator, the house of silence. Her testimony was a cascade of truth, washing away the last remnants of Catherine's carefully constructed lies. While the officers took her statement, the CPS team, armed with a warrant Julian's legal team had prepared, entered the house. They emerged minutes later with the locked cabinet from the bathroom and the journal. The evidence was absolute, the case sealed. Catherine, wrapped in a blanket by a paramedic, was quietly led to one of the cars. She didn't look at Julian or Lily. She seemed to be in a world of her own, muttering about dust and stains. The spell was broken. The fortress had fallen. Her world, so meticulously, obsessively controlled, had completely unraveled in the space of half an hour. The rescue was complete. Julian took official temporary custody of Lily that evening. The legal formalities were a blur, handled by his team with ruthless efficiency. The last act in that house was the most important. He walked upstairs to Lily's showroom of a bedroom, the one she had never truly lived in. She stood in the doorway, hesitant to enter. Julian went to the bed and picked up Barnaby, the one-eyed, worn teddy bear. He held it out to her. "I think it's time Barnaby had a new home, don't you?" he said softly. She took the bear, clutching it to her chest like a shield. He then packed a small bag with her things, the few that seemed to hold any meaning, and left the rest. He didn't want to take any part of the prison with them. As they walked down the grand staircase for the last time, he scooped her up into his arms. She was so light. He carried her out the front door, across the cold marble foyer, and into the waiting car, never looking back. Their first night of freedom was spent in his penthouse suite, a place of glass and steel high above the city lights. It was a world away from the suffocating silence of the estate. He had ordered food, pizza, ice cream, everything messy and forbidden. He laid it all out on the low coffee table in the living room. Lily just stared at it. She picked up a slice of pizza but held it with the same rigid precision she'd used with the silverware. Julian sat on the floor beside her and took a huge, greasy bite of his own slice, letting a drop of sauce fall onto his shirt. "Oops," he said with a small smile. Lily watched him, her eyes wide. He didn't run to clean it. He didn't panic. He just laughed a little. Tentatively, she took a tiny bite. Later, he showed her to her new room. It was simple, with a bed and a dresser, but the walls were bare. "We can decorate it however you want," he told her. "Posters, paint, anything." She just nodded, clutching Barnaby. That night, he was woken by a small sound. He found her in the kitchen, in the glow of the refrigerator light, stuffing a bread roll into the pocket of her pajamas. The old survival instinct, hoarding food, a classic sign of neglect, cut him to the core. He didn't scold her. He gently took the roll from her hand, led her back to the kitchen, and showed her how the fridge was full, how the cupboards were stocked. "You can eat any time you want," he promised her. "You will never be hungry here." She fell asleep later in her own bed, but the nightmares came. He sat by her side, a silent vigil, until her thrashing subsided. As the first light of dawn broke over the city, he looked at his sleeping daughter, at the faint red marks still visible on her wrists, and made a silent vow. The old Julian Blackwood, the empire builder, was gone. His new mission was the patient, painstaking reconstruction of a stolen childhood. He knew the road ahead was long, filled with therapists and patient conversations and the slow work of building trust. He felt a profound fear, the fear of failing her again, but it was overshadowed by an even more profound hope for their future. A year later, the penthouse was no longer a monument to minimalist wealth. It was a home. The walls of the living room were covered in bright, messy, chaotic finger paintings. A half-finished Lego castle occupied a significant portion of the floor. The sound of laughter, once an alien concept, was now a daily occurrence. Lily was still quiet by nature, but her silence was no longer born of fear. It was the thoughtful silence of a child at play, a child at peace. Catherine had been found not guilty by reason of insanity and was committed to a long-term psychiatric facility. Julian had received a single, rambling letter from her, filled with obsessive talk of purity and cleanliness. He had burned it without showing it to Lily. Her mother was a ghost now, a story to be dealt with when she was older and stronger. One Saturday afternoon, they were in the kitchen, making pancakes. Julian, true to form, flipped one too high, and it landed squarely on his head. He stood there, dripping with batter, and looked at Lily. For a moment, she just stared, her eyes wide. And then it happened. A small giggle escaped her lips. It grew into a full, uninhibited, joyous laugh, the sound he had been waiting a year to hear. It was the sound of a little girl who knew she was safe. A sound that washed away the last of the silence, the last of the antiseptic, the last of the fear. She pointed at him, her face alight with a glee he remembered from a lifetime ago. "Silly Daddy," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Hat pancake." He reached out and pulled her into a hug, the smell of pancake batter and the sound of her laughter filling his senses. He had his daughter back. Not the ghost he had mourned, not the doll he had rescued, but the living, laughing, wonderfully messy child she was always meant to be. He had failed her once, a lifetime ago, but now every single day was a chance to get it right. And he would not waste another second. What does it take to truly see the prisons that exist behind perfect facades? We are taught to admire spotless homes and well-behaved children, but how often do we question the silence that accompanies that perfection? Have you ever had a gut feeling that something was wrong, even when everything looked right? We invite you to share your own stories of listening to that quiet inner voice, of choosing to see what lies beneath the surface, because sometimes the most important truths are the ones that are never spoken aloud.